I'm just greedy, to go back in the past. I think my first answer will be to go back to 1800 BCE, be living next to a port city somewhere in Gujarat when the Harappan civilization or the Indus Saraswati civilization was at its peak.
On the one hand, we are so contemporary, we are so uber modern in our minds, but at the same time, we're very connected. Many of us are very connected to our past.
We are very complex. Our philosophies, our religions that inform our culture as well, that inform our food, inform our habits.
As a kid, she was attracted to the adventurous tales of Indiana Jones and Lara Croft. The idea of embarking on expeditions into jungles and unknown territories always thrilled her. In the initial years of her career, she worked in fashion and sports marketing but found herself yearning for something more. That's when she went on to do her master's in archaeology, and the rest is literally history. As a topic that is super close to my heart, I'm sure that this is going to be an exciting episode for everyone that likes to dig deeper. Let's welcome writer, researcher, and archaeologist Anika Maan. The Iconic Women podcast is a platform where we've come together to tell the authentic stories of women. These are women from different geographies, different eras in our history, as well as contemporary women today. We're going to continue to bring you great stories from women across India. If you like our content, don't forget to subscribe and to hit the bell icon for all further updates. And please don't forget to like and share.
What is it about archaeology that has us so fascinated? Even little children want to be archaeologists and paleontologists. What is it about digging up our past, like literally digging up our past, that just has our fascination?
There are so many things in popular culture, I think, that have kind of instigated it. But I guess why it happened for me is because it's like a mystery novel that you can actually solve. And it's not a crime novel, it's history, right? So it allows you to come up with a question like, why did this happen? Why did this war happen? And you become the solver of that mystery using books, reading media, or whatever. So it feels very as an approachable form of coming up with answers. And then also looking at the past can be very fascinating for some people, You discover a lot about yourself. You discover why is society like this? Why is mankind like this? Why are we behaving in this way today? And when you discover those things, not only about yourself, but about society and the world at large, you feel that you have done it. And I think that's what makes archaeology so fascinating for people, because you can never run out of questions that you can go ahead and answer yourself. So I think that may be it. But obviously, in a country like India that is riddled with so much culture, so much history, every 5 kilometers, there's a new story to be found.
Yeah.
Finding that history and then finding out about what that history has done to us is a revelation that I think very seldom people do not enjoy. You know what I mean?
Right.
So-
And I think it's only growing, right? I mean, this need that we have now to know our history and to know more about it, I think it's just the beginning of everything that's going to be unearthed, and so much research that's going on that's kind of starting to put this jigsaw puzzle together of how old is India really and what all has been going on for so many millennia.
Yes, and how old is India? How international has India been? I guess what's most intriguing to all of us is our own identity. And I think identity is greatly embedded in discovering our own histories, whether it's our personal history, our family history, a state's history, a region's history, the linguistic history, so much. And because history and material culture give you that, give you all the answers that you need. If you ask about females or women in India,
Which I'm going to do.
yes, I'm looking forward to it. But then you look at the amount of female representation in India in terms of material culture, on temples, in churches, in books, in drawings, in speeches, in poetry. Um, you investigate a little bit more. So you feel like a little bit of a detective where history is your playground.
Amazing. Yeah. You know, this is a question I keep asking myself, and every time there are different answers. But if you could reach into our ancient past, anywhere in the world, and you could make contact somewhere, where would that be?
Oh my God, this is a question that I have so many answers. I'm just greedy, to go back in the past. I think my first answer will be to go back to 1800 BCE, be living next to a port city somewhere in Gujarat when the Harappan civilization or the Indus-Saraswati civilization was at its peak. Um, and to just figure out that language, just figure out what how did they communicate, what was happening at that particular point in time. And I would have wanted to be a sailor. So that is one time period. But the second time period, I'm sorry, you asked me one, but I'll give you two.
Sure, go for
The
it.
second time period, I think, has to be around mid 10th century. I would have wanted to be in Odisha, again as a seafarer,
Yeah.
somewhere near Konark. And I would have wanted to be on one of those ships that is going towards Southeast Asia,
Right.
and trading and building Southeast Asia, and to figure out what was happening in the Shakta tradition, in the Kola Shakta tradition that was flourishing in the East at that point in time, uninhibited.
Right.
It is also around that time that we had the Buddhist universities at there that was still functioning. So I would have wanted to be one of those mercantile scholars who was traveling between the Odisha universities, between the ports, going to Southeast Asia. So yes, an international traveler, either from the 1800 BCE or from mid 10th century CE. Yes.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about the Shakta tradition a little more, sort of unpack that a little further into the podcast. But speaking about India, right? We have historically been such a melting pot, where different races and ethnicities and cultures have come in and just kind of merged with what India was and made India their home. And that has gone on down the centuries, right? Even till today, you could say. But the reason I'm asking you this is that, as a person who's kind of intimately familiar with our past, how do you think all of this sort of mingling of cultures makes our present today? So how does it influence what India is today?
I think India is a highly complex land. To an outsider, it can be rather overwhelming because India came up with a lot of things on their own. And I think the people of India and the culture of India has a lot of tribute to pay to the geography of India. And that country is completely inundated with rivers on all sides.
Yeah.
It has the eastern and the western Ghats that work the monsoon so well for the country. It has a plateau that raises, we're sitting in Bangalore right now, which is also on this plateau and is blessed with gorgeous weather throughout the year for a subtropical country, which is an anomaly. Then you have the Himalayas, you have Himalayan deserts. All of these geographical areas initiated their own very local culture
Right.
that seamlessly blended into the larger Indian culture. Now, Indian culture, one would think, starts from the Rig Vedas, etc. A lot of archaeologists would not agree because civilizations have flourished before that. Whether it is the Harappan civilization or it is the larger Asian civilizations that were functioning simultaneously at that time. You had Cyrus the Great, who was somewhere in the Near East, who had intentions very much so to come to India. They were setting up satrapies or their provinces around. And India was considered a place that was paying tribute to that empire. Then you have Darius the First. And India was the furthermost, easternmost kind of area that was paying tribute, but the tribute was the highest.
Really?
The highest, paying
In the
in
time
gold
of
dust.
Cyrus the Great.
Yes, from Darius the First, we have inscriptional evidence of this, that India was paying the highest tribute. But maybe these gentlemen never really, like Cyrus the Great, we don't know exactly if he came to India. Darius, yes, he did come to India. He traveled all the way down the Indus, navigated it, came down to the Arabian Sea, and then went on to the Red Sea, went on to Egypt, cut a canal across the Nile and opened up trade like anything. But my question is, why was India paying the largest amount of tribute when it is not even in the heart of that empire? Because India was always a very rich land. And where does that richness come from? It does not come from printing currency. It comes from the natural resources that we had. India during the Harappan civilization was known to trade fantastic quality timber. It was known to trade gold, carnelian, agate, jasper, lapis lazuli. In fact, because we do not know the script, we even know that India traded how far, because of these materials that were found in India have been found in those areas, apart from seals and other objects.
Right.
So it's been so rich as a geographical land. If you zoom out onto the map of the world, you see from the Sahara Desert to the Thar Desert, there is this aridity of the land that ends at India. And then you have the Ganga Jamuna belt that becomes suddenly so lush and green. Now, if you go back in time, the Harappan civilization was on the western periphery of India. And then as civilizations move forward, there's also a period where we don't know very much about what happened from the decline of the Harappan civilization till the beginnings of the Vedic civilization or the Vedic period. But what we do know is that, territories and areas were shifting. People in India were India was always very populated, but they were intermingling and setting down systems. Now, one must also imagine, from the period you have thought something to the period you actually write it, to the period it becomes the most popular thing, the rule of the law of the land.
Are you referring to a particular text?
Any text, okay? If I have to write a book, from the time I will think it, to the time I will research it, to the time it is actually written and published, to the time that everyone knows about it, that's a long period of time. And that long period of time without the marketing tools that we have now is even longer. So it is the geography, it is the different indigenous groups of people coming together, integrating with a larger polity that made this land extremely rich. Now, we think that Indian culture starts at a point where we can actually read it. So it was the Vedic texts that we have, begun to read, the Brahmi text, the Pali text, the Prakrit text. Before that, a huge civilization existed. And when that civilization existed, there were several civilizations around the world that were interacting. Cyrus the Great, Darius, essentially were the beginnings of Zoroastrianism.
Right.
And now India is one of those lands that harbors a huge community of Parsis, Then we were a land of Buddhism and Jainism, Buddhism in the East, Jainism in the West. Buddhism, yes, it has become extinct in its own motherland. But look at Asia.
And for the longest time, India was primarily Buddhist, right?
To a great extent, obviously, we have a lot of material culture of Buddhist India. But then it was driven out of extinction in 3 waves when it left. But you look all around the world, India never colonized anyone.
That's true.
India never did that. But everywhere there is an imprint of India. If you meditate, it's probably come from India. If you do yoga, well, it's definitely Indian.
Or if you believe in karma.
If you believe in karma, if you believe in artha, if you believe in salvation, if you believe in so many regular contemporary life philosophies have found their roots in India.
Speaking of the Rig Veda, which you just mentioned, I feel like we live in different time zones. On the one hand, we are so contemporary, we are so uber modern in our minds, but at the same time, we're very connected. Many of us are very connected to our past, to these texts and scriptures and ways of living life and believing in what we believe in. Do you think that the Indian mind is kind of unique that way and therefore uniquely complex?
Absolutely. I do think it is within our very being. Being Indian is plural. It is several kinds of cultures all rolled up into our very own personality. And it doesn't matter whether I come from Delhi or you come from Bangalore. We will identify as Indians, even though
Course,
you
yeah.
will eat and speak a completely different way, and I will eat and speak a completely different way. Yet, our broader cultural obligations in this country, whether you are Christian, Jain, Hindu, Parsi, our broader cultural obligations are kind of similar.
Yeah.
Yes, we are very complex. Our philosophies, our religions that inform our culture as well, that inform our food, inform our habits are very, very, very deep. And sometimes we don't even know how deep they are, but we will always practice them. We will always perform them. We could be completely atheist. A person could be atheist in India, but they are not acultural,
That's right.
because that
Yeah,
culture
yeah.
permeates so deep in us.
Yeah, that's so true.
Whether it is eating with your right hand or it is, kind of bowing in obeisance to a dead body crossing by, to any of the things, cultural habits are so deeply ingrained in us. And it can be called tradition, but I think it is also the joy of being Indian. The carnival of India is enjoyed mostly by us.
Right.
And the biggest the present all these festivals have given us is so many bank holidays. When you work in an international conglomerate, sometimes foreign companies get a little perturbed. They're like, so many national holidays.
Again, you guys are off. Yeah.
Again, you guys are off. Like Diwali time, Christmas time, Holi time, Independence Day, Republic Day. There's just so much. They're patriotic holidays and they're cultural holidays. I would say history is deeply embedded in us, whether we know it or not. We are a cultural being. We are a very complex society. We owe a lot to the intellectual tradition of our ancestors,
Right.
no matter where we are, whether we are in Kashmir or whether we are in Kerala or whether we are in Andhra Pradesh or whether we are in the Northeast, whether we are in Assam, where you had Southeast Asian rulers coming there. But then everyone who came to India became even more Indian rather than converting
Yeah.
India to, somewhat like their culture. I think overall we have great respect for cultural affiliations of any society, any community, or any group. Whether it is harboring the Tibetans in Delhi, in a beautiful place called Majnu Ka Tila.
Yeah. And in fact, they're all over the country, right?
They're
In
all
little
over the country.
communities.
Even in Mysore, there's a huge population.
Right. Karnataka has a lot of them.
Yes. Huge population of Tibetans. So we welcomed them, whether it is our neighboring South Asian countries that are going through a troubling time, India has kind of opened its doors to them as well, historically. So this culture, and it integrates those people into its culture, So if you go today to Tibetan colonies, you will see how they proudly showcase the Himalayan culture, and it is, and India resonates with it just because of the variety of geographies we have. We very quickly adapt and identify with it and make room for these newer communities to kind of live with us.
Right. Yeah. I hear what you're saying about us just being kind of a deeply cultural nation. And I think that, now what's going on, there's a lot of research coming out through archaeology. So for instance, about the Saraswati River Valley, right? That's a big one right now.
A lot of scholars prefer Indus-Saraswati civilization to acknowledge the two big river systems that supported the actual spread of this. It also does justice to give the amount of area occupied by this huge, fairly uniform civilization. They were localized in the way they built their cities, but most of their cities had a very uniform system across the board. Also, the river that supported the civilization were the best highways. In ancient past, you could get lost on the road, but the river will only lead you to one destination,
Yeah.
because it has only one path and one stream. So I guess it won't really change anything, but yes, it will certainly expand the depth of knowledge we have on that matter. For example, Haryana became very, very conscious and with its front foot forward about its history of the Indus Valley civilization or the Harappan civilization. There were several scholars who've done fantastic work, but one of the scholars who explored the Haryana Harappan sites was this scholar called Suraj Bhan, who was teaching at Kurukshetra University. And when he kind of explored all of these sites and pinned them on a map, you saw there is some kind of route that is being formed.
Right.
Saraswati is greatly referenced in much later literature from the Harappan civilization. For example, in the Vedic civilization as a mighty gushing river, wide,
Yeah.
but then we don't see it now. We do have some aspects of the Saraswati River that do exist. Like in Haryana, you have something called the Saraswati Nadi, which is a small stream. So with the Saraswati delta, with the Saraswati belt, I think exploring it still seems like a very exciting proposition, not only for archaeologists, but also for geologists, because again, the mystery, the act of solving a mystery is extremely exciting, but it also tells us a lot about our land and also the cultures that may have existed around it. So there are many reasons to know more about it, maybe track more Harappan sites, but at the same time, figure out how water worked back in the past and what mistakes. If this was a man-made disaster that the river went away, then what mistakes can we learn from? So different vantage points of questioning why that river existed. It's such a gushing stream that was internationally recognized, and today we just can't seem to find it. There are many reasons to find that out,
And is the Saraswati River Valley completely distinct from the Indus Valley or the Harappan Valley civilization? Or do they overlap? Is it different names for the same civilization? What is it?
No, they are a uniform civilization from Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, from the topmost sites of the Harappan civilization right down to Lothal, Gujarat. You have a certain sense of uniformity that was followed. It was a civilization that was interacting with each other. It was trading very heavily internationally. They were building ships. In fact, we have references of ships with birds on top of them. That means they knew even how to navigate turbulent seas. Why? Do you know why you have a bird on top of a sea, on top of a
Because
ship?
when the bird flies, it's going to fly towards the land. Right?
So if a bird flies and doesn't come back, that means land is not far. But if a bird flies and comes back, that means keep sailing. You
Okay,
still got to
yeah.
find land.
Makes sense.
So we have a representation of a ship in material culture with two birds just perched on it.
Right.
So essentially, no, they were not distinct from each other, even though each city has its own identity. If a city is built in the middle of the Run of Kutch, Dholavira,
Yeah.
it will have some unique aspects about it.
Yeah.
Whereas a city that is in the heartland of Haryana, like Rakhi Gadi, will have distinct aspects about it. Some places they use burnt bricks, some places they use sun-dried bricks. But the weights and measures, the kind of seals that come out, the kind of jewelry that comes out, there was a lot of uniformity and coordination amongst them. So it's not as if you're finding two distinct cultures, but you're finding a larger civilization that has its own individualized identities that gives you so much more insight upon our very proto-ancient people,
Yeah.
And moreover, it gives this fantastic insight that human society should be very proud of, that back in the old times, not only were they smart people who were building, but they were intelligent, curious, adventurous people who were exploring and expanding, not because they had empires in mind, although some did, but because they were trading and building such richness in this country that to this day still feeds our own identities,
Right. Yeah. Coming to women from ancient India, right? so when you look at women in ancient India, whatever we have, right? So say it's the Indus Valley dancing girl, or it is Chola sculptures, or anything in between. They seem to embody this kind of grace and strength and boldness, and beauty, right? Which is a different kind of beauty. What was life like for women in ancient India? And I know that this is a very generic question. Feel free to break it up however you want.
Well, there is no objective way to answer it because the answers are, there are so many answers to it. But I do feel that in ancient India, women did play an active role in society. Their representation in material culture is not scarce. In fact, the tradition allowed for acknowledge the power of the female. So some of the earliest sculptures that we have found in India, yes, could be called mother goddesses, but also have been called fertility goddesses.
Right.
Women were acknowledged very early on, not only in India, but around the world, but very much so in India. I'm proud of our country for doing that, that you are the creators of life. And thus, everything and society culture kind of breathes through you, not just you. Both genders and all genders have a role to play in it.
Yeah.
But because the women are a vessel, I do feel that they were acknowledged for it. Then we have also extant texts in India like the Manusmriti or the Yajnavalkya that understood the female body in such a way that, yes, we even have controversial things like how to produce a son, and then there are ways that, okay, the male needs to be stronger at this particular point in time, and the female needs to be a little bit meeker, a bit weaker, a little bit starved, so that his aspect dominates, and thus a son is created. Although none of these things, I think, really
Are
do
scientifically
work.
true.
But I am never surprised when I'm proved wrong about the veracity and the thought behind ancient science. Back in the day, I mean, we found the decimal system. We found zero.
Right.
Albert Einstein says that, that we as mathematicians and scientists owe a lot to the Indian people.
Really?
Because without them not having found the basic principles of mathematics like zero and a decimal system, etc., we would not have been able to calculate such difficult problems. Now, coming back to applying that kind of a scientific inquiry onto the landscape of women in India, I think they played multitudes of roles. We have ancient queens, but at the same time, we have goddesses that we most least understand, and they are the most protected and guarded and secretive cult. Why? Because women are very powerful creatures. I'm talking in the metaphysical world. Extremely powerful creatures. They come from the earth. They are green in fertility, and you do not want to anger them.
Mess with them.
You do not want to mess with them. Even sometimes in our mythologies and our texts, when the men couldn't handle something that was very difficult, they called upon the women, and the women came like a bloodthirsty army and just settled everything for the men.
Right.
So what I am very, very curious, and I have been as a student of archaeology, and I still consider myself a student of archaeology and student of history, that the acknowledgement of the role of women, not only in politics, not only in society, not only in culture, but in the heavens and hells together, has been done fantastically in India. I don't think I've found such a deep and a rich way of doing that anywhere else. I mean, I can't get over the topic. I study it all the time. And sometimes I have to pull myself out of it because it's just a realm that will take multiple lifetimes to truly understand.
I love that you say multiple lifetimes.
I mean, we are Indian, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the Shakta tradition and the Shakta worship, right? Where does that really originate? Do we know how old it is? Where did it start? Did it start with the Devi Suktam by Vakambrini, where she talks about, the mother goddess as the originator of all of life and the universe. And then from there, it kind of goes down to other studies, or where does it begin?
I think there is, again, no exactly right answer to this. There are many, many, many ways of looking at it. I would say that back in the earliest times, when indigenous communities were not a homogenous, India was not a homogenous country. It had several subcultures and smaller cultures existing, from rural hinterlands to big city states that were being formed. And the kind of religious or the cultural structure that was being formed in India started taking into account a lot of female worship, or female goddesses that were Gram Devatas.
Right.
Now, as that was happening, from Shalabhanjikas to Yakshis, like the Didarganj Yakshi, the biggest mysterious woman, you know, tall, beautiful, polished sandstone sculpture of this royally decorated lady with a fly whisk. Who is she? And why haven't we found another piece of sculpture that is so opulent like hers? To Buddhist nuns like Amrapali, who hosted the Buddha when he came in the east of India, and then was given, the status of a Buddhist nun. To all the women depicted in the Ajanta paintings. I mean, they are so beautiful, so voluptuous, so sensual. What was the reason that we showed them in the way that we showed them? And then when we started slowly assimilating them more formally, came about several cosmologies of female goddesses, from the Saptamatrikas to the Ashtamatrikas to the Chausat Yogini to the Dashamavidyas to Durga on her own, to consorts of existing male gods. All of them are so separate, but at the same time so intertwined with each other. They don't have a single origin story. It is a deep mystery that scholars like Vidya Dehejia and so many others, Professor Madhu Khanna, Professor Alexis Sanderson, Harunaga Isaacson, all of them, have tried to indulge, but we can only find out from sources that are available to us, right? So as far as we go, this is a study that requires a lot of concentration, because a lot of the texts that are also written, the Yogini Tantras, for example, are highly tedious to read. What is written and what may be the obvious Sanskritic meaning may not actually be the meaning.
They're very coded, right?
Extremely coded, layered. A lotus could mean just the flower, or lotus could mean a female genitalia, right? The dew on the lotus could mean morning dew, or it could mean absolutely something else. And it is through initiation that one is actually given the luxury or given the privilege of the revelation as to what it is. And, being a practitioner as opposed to being someone who is within this realm of religious observance, or someone who's just a cultural person, at every stage, you get to know a lot more. And at every stage, you can engage much deeper. So whether you're going to the Shakti Pitas, or you are going to the Yogini temples, or you are going to just a site with the Saptamatrikas, or you are worshipping the snake goddess, depending on where your affiliations are, an entire universe will be revealed to you. And all of them are equally deep and complex.
The Chausat Yogini, I've read a little bit about them, and I just feel, from whatever I know, that it must be one of India's best kept secrets. There is so much kind of mystery and awe around them. There's so much that's hidden in terms of the practice. Why a circular temple? Why these 64 yoginis? And what would worship have looked like in one of the Chausat Yogini temples back in the day?
I think the worship, how it would have looked like, you could refer to any of the sadhana manuals of worshipping the goddess. And you will see that levels of visualization, levels of practice, levels of dramatic practices were only for those who were initiated into that realm. Also, they also say that it is such a, tightly held philosophy
Right.
that if you tell an uninitiated person the secrets of this, you'll be punished by the yoginis.
Mhm.
And why? It's not because there's something bad happening here. There's something very delicate and very powerful happening here.
Mm.
And it's like giving that power to someone, you have to be very careful about who you give it to, right? So when I was studying at Oxford, I was translating a manuscript that was written in Vikramashila University. It was a Buddhist manuscript, and it was worshipping a deity called Hivajra, which is a Buddhist fierce deity. And when you do that, when you're worshipping and you're already initiated, you're supposed to do your prayers regularly. Those prayers are also called sadhana. They are deeply meditative. They require visualization, they require heavy rituals at certain points of time in the day and only in certain locations. And what are those locations? Those locations are very matching to where the yogini temples are also set up.
Really?
Either on top of a hill
Mm.
or at a cremation ground or deep in a forest somewhere. What do I see in common of these sites? Privacy. Privacy to do an uninterrupted practice that should not be misunderstood by a lay observer, right? So one can now only allude to what sort of rituals or how prayers, let's call it that, how prayers were conducted at these temples. Now, if you'll go to these temples, Chauset is 64. The number 64 is the root of the number 8, right? It's a very powerful number. And obviously, we Indians, the creators of astrology, who dominated astronomy back in the day, we actually calculated through a very important scholar called Brahmagupta 365.23 something days of the year as well, just by observing the stars. I mean, I'm jealous of how clear the skies were back then. But, in terms of scientific indulgence, inquiry, and really slowing down time to make a note of the constituents of time, when you superimpose it on a very complicated ritual of these Chauset Yogini temples, and you look at the sculptures as well, those sculptures, each sculpture is heavily coded. From the vehicle of the goddess to why does she have an animal face,
Yeah.
to why is she so voluptuous, to why in Bhedaghat, which is in on the limestone hills of Jabalpur in Madhya Pradesh, why are these goddesses sitting in Lalit Asana? That means 1 foot down and 1 foot up in a cross-legged fashion, sitting in a relaxed position. Whereas at Hirapur in Odisha, just outside Bhubaneswar, why are they all dancing? So all of these questions are deep questions, and one must be an initiate because these are matters of the metaphysical world, so one has to be very respectful of them. And thus, imagination may go wild, but root it in the study of these texts. And I would always recommend people to read scholars like Vidya Daheja, who's written the most important book on the Yogini temples. And she has even done her best through literary texts and visiting these sites. I've been fortunate, barring one site, I visited all of these sites.
How many yogini temples do we have in India?
There are less than 8, let me put it in that way. And a lot of them are destroyed as well. Unfortunately, the more powerful the deity, the more coveted that sculpture, right? India is a victim of antiquity smuggling since a long, 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 long time. And it is these yogini sculptures that are the most expensive in the black
Really?
market, yes.
There's also the Dasha Mahavidyas, right, which you spoke about. And they also are just endlessly fascinating, right? There is Chinnamasta, there is Bhuvaneshwari, there is Matangi and Dhumavati. Where do they originate? Are they also originally Gram Devis who then kind of became absorbed into the larger pantheon, or what is their origin?
I think there are also several theories about them. We don't have a codex book that tells us this is how it happened. It is all inference and interpretation based on how these ladies have to be worshipped, right? And several scholars have come up with many sort of provisions for how it could have happened, but there is no exactly right answer to this as well. But one can, when you do study these goddesses individually, and you understand as to who serves what purpose, you know, a particular goddess is worshipped to acquire siddhis, and the best siddhi can also be attaining flight. A particular goddess is worshipped for exacting revenge, whereas a particular goddess is for fortune and boon. Then you have benign versions of that goddess, and then you have the very fiery versions of that goddess. There is a benign version of Saraswati, and then there's a fiery version of Saraswati amongst the Dasha Mahavidyas. There is Kali, Durga. There is also Kamala, who is Lakshmi, you
Yeah.
know. So it depends on what is the purpose of worshipping these goddesses, where are you worshipping them, who are you worshipping, are they being worshipped in conjunction with each other or individually? These slight alterations completely change the metaphysics that you are engaging with. And India has always been accused of not writing history right, but it has never been celebrated for the volume of prescriptive texts that tell you how to perform or how to do certain things a certain way,
Like manual.
like manuals, like the Rig Veda, the Puranas, the Aryanakas, the several sadhana manuals, the Agama texts, the Tantra texts, the Shakta texts, the Kola texts. What are they? They are prescriptive texts. They are not saying how it was. They are not involved in that. They are saying how you must continue, how you must do,
Right.
how you must build, how you must sculpt, how you must worship, how you must perform, how you must apologize, how you must celebrate. So it's time we get celebrated for a country that was so committed to continuing its culture rather than just telling the story of its culture.
So that brings us to the end of the first part of my chat with Anika Mann. Do stay tuned for the second part of this episode, where we talk about fascinating eras in our history, as well as some completely unforgettable women.